All right, so for handout 3D, we need to elaborate a little bit more on diffusion and osmosis. Diffusion is super simple, but I do have an example of this. And then osmosis is very similar, but involves water. It's a little confusing to some students because it has to deal with a solute. And so that can be a little bit confusing. So let's look at this handout 3D. And the first part of it is going to be diffusion. Diffusion is a piece of cake. All you got to remember is that molecules are going to always move from high concentration to low concentration. So imagine I've got a beaker full of molecules. I've got blue molecules and red molecules. Now, the blue molecules I put in the bottom of the beaker. The red molecules are sitting on top. Now, just because of physics, what's going to happen is these blue molecules are going to want to move from high concentration to low concentration. So they're going to want to move up. The red molecules are going to do the same thing. They want to move from high concentration to lower concentration. So the red molecules are going to move down. So if I put these together, we're going to see the blue molecules moving up, the red molecules moving down from high to low concentration. This is going to continue until all of the molecules are evenly distributed throughout the beaker, and then diffusion will stop. Now, the only difference between diffusion and facilitated diffusion is that with facilitated diffusion, these molecules are going to want to move through the membrane through a channel protein. So it's facilitating or helping the diffusion. Molecules need to move through that plasma membrane, but they may be too big, so we have to have a channel protein to allow them to move. That's the only difference between diffusion and facilitated diffusion. Now, the second part of this is osmosis. Osmosis, I wrote here, is the movement of water from low solute to high solute. And the solute is almost always some kind of salt. So we have a salt in solution, or it's dissociated, but the water's going to try and equalize between this solute. So there's a classic little experiment that you might have actually performed in high school, where we take a beaker of distilled water that has no salt in it at all, it's just distilled water. We take a test tube that's open on the end, we put a membrane across the bottom, and we add a 3% salt solution to that test tube. Now, if we put this salt solution into distilled water, the distilled water is going to have a low salt content. The test tube is going to have a higher salt content of 3%. So what's going to happen is the water is going to move from low salt to high salt. So the water is going to move from this beaker through the membrane and into the test tube. And if you perform this experiment, you can see the water actually rise in the test tube. This will occur until both the beaker and the test tube have the same concentration of water to salt. So usually what happens if you let it run long enough is the salt concentration will cause so much water to move into the test tube that it'll just overflow. This is osmosis. So we move from a low salt through the membrane to a higher salt. Now, if you think about this, it's really not much different than diffusion. In diffusion, we're moving from a high concentration of a molecule to a lower concentration. Well, think of the water. If we have more salt in the test tube, there's less water. So we have less water and more salt in the test tube. We have more water and less salt in the beaker. So the water is moving from a higher concentration of water to a lower concentration of water where the salt is. But we don't describe it that way. We describe it as we are moving from low salt to a higher salt to balance it out. That is osmosis. And so you need to think about that a little bit and kind of digest what is going on with osmosis. So for our final online handout, Handout 3E, I'm going to give you an example of osmosis with glucose. And we're going to introduce to you how glucose is moved through our body and into our cells. So let's proceed with that video. All right, I'll see you soon.